Hello and welcome to my advanced tanking guide for the Blood Death Knight in World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth. Now, this is a follow-up to my beginner's tanking guide, and if you are maybe unfamiliar with the Blood Death Knight, you're not really sure about some of the abilities, you haven't done a lot of tanking on it, or maybe you feel like you're missing some really core concepts, then I recommend you check that video out. I'll have a link in the description below. Also, if you are tanking, higher level mythics and things like that, this guide is probably below your skill level, so I recommend that you look for something else. This guide is mainly intended to help new tanks who have got the handle on everything we covered in the beginner's guide and want to advance their gameplay into heroics or lower level mythics. So that's kind of where the skill cap is here. Now, in this video, we're going to be following up on that beginner's guide. We're going to take the passive build that we created in the guide, and we're going to be updating it with a new talent build that's going to add in some active abilities, give us a little bit more complexity, maybe some more buttons to push, and it's definitely going to be a more suitable talent build for tanking at higher difficulties. Then we're going to talk about anything that changes with our rotation based on the changes that we made for that talent build. We're going to talk about how to set the pace in the dungeon on a Blood Death Knight, as well as how to play offensively or defensively depending on the situation. And then we're just going to close with any final notes that we have. So, if that sounds like useful information to you, stay tuned. Don't forget that you can check the timestamps in the description below to skip to the sections that you think are the most relevant to you. And I thank you for watching. Let's get started. Okay, so taking a look at the passive build that we created in the beginner's guide, we're going to make a couple of changes here to update the talents, and we're going to talk about some additional choices that you have depending on the situation. So not a whole lot is going to change here. We're going to change 2, maybe 3 abilities, and our new talent build is going to look like this. So as you can see, we changed 3 abilities here. And some of these were just changing based on my personal preference, and you're going to have some options to do whatever you prefer to do. So our first change is going to be here on the first tier. Now in our passive build we have Heart Strike or Heartbreaker. This allows our Heart Strike to generate 2 additional runic power per hit. So this is going to help us to generate more runic power and funnel that into our defensive abilities. So if you're in a situation where you feel like you're still kind of struggling on the defensive end, maybe you're taking a little bit too much damage based on the difficulty level that you're playing at, you can keep Heartbreaker. This is, generally speaking, the preferred talent to choose if you are really pushing the limits of your skill. However, if you are not necessarily at that point, maybe you're a little bit back from that, you're doing better in dungeons, generally speaking, your health is staying up, or you've got a good healer, then I would recommend taking Blood Drinker, and that is my preferred personal ability. I like this because this essentially is a single target ability on a 30-second cooldown that does a bunch of damage to that single target. Also, while you're using Blood Drinker, you're able to move, parry, dodge, and use defensive abilities while channeling. So as long as you're not actively trying to attack the enemy while you're using Blood Drinker, then you can still use your defensive abilities. The reason that I like this ability personally is because it gives you a way to do a significant amount of damage to an enemy. So if you find yourself in a bad situation where there's a particular enemy that really needs to die, this gives you the utility to do that. If you're in a situation where you're fighting against a boss, this is a good ability to use against a boss to put in some extra damage. Anytime you're in a situation where you're doing perfectly fine as far as your defense is concerned, this is a great ability to use to help increase the damage output of your Blood Death Knight and just help your party out. So depending on the situation, I would take one or the other of these. Take Heartbreaker if you're really pushing the limits of your skill or trying to get into higher and higher difficulty situations. If you're in a situation where you're comfortable, take Blood Drinker for the extra DPS and the single target utility. Next up, our next change is going to be here on the 75 tier. So we currently have Tightening Grasp. Now in the beginner's guide, we picked Tightening Grasp so that you would have the opportunity to use Gorfine's Grasp more often and kind of get used to it. Now, you can still take this ability. However, the other two abilities on this tier are absolutely viable as well. This is another area where you have some choice. And generally speaking, a lot of people will take Grip of the Dead. This will cause your Death and Decay, which, if you remember, is our big AoE ability, to reduce the speed of enemies within the area by 90%, decaying by 10% every second. So what this does is this makes uh, your Death and Decay become more of a crowd control ability. This helps you to keep all the enemies targeted in a pretty tight knot around you and kind of prevents them from running all over the place. So when you get into higher difficulties, this is really going to be good for you. Now, the ability that I personally have chosen is Wraith Walk. This is another good ability. So in any situation where you really don't need that crowd control from Death and Decay, you could pick up Wraith Walk, or if you just prefer this based on your playstyle, then this is a good option as well. Wraith Walk has a 1-minute cooldown. It allows you to sidestep into the Shadowlands, removing all root effects and increasing your movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds. Taking any action cancels the effect. While active, your movement speed cannot be reduced below 170%. So, one of the big things with Death Knights is we don't have a lot of ways to increase our speed. We don't have a whole lot of mobility. So, as you can see here with the two talent choices that we've discussed, I've opted for things that allow me to be a little bit more mobile. With Blood Drinker, I can move, dodge, parry, use defensive abilities while also dealing damage. So, that gives me a little mobility. And then with Wraith Walk, every minute I'm able to get this nice 70% speed boost. Now that can help me get out of a hairy situation if I'm trying to dodge an AoE or something like that. It can also just help me move from pack to pack or keep up with party members who, generally speaking, have better movement abilities than we do and can speed off ahead of us. So I just like the utility and the versatility of Wraith Walk. Now, there are scenarios where you're going to be playing higher difficulty content and you're still going to want to take Wraith Walk. Like some fights require a good amount of mobility, and so Wraith Walk is a good choice there. Otherwise, I would say take Grip of the Dead. So once again, this kind of comes down to a personal preference, and for me, I really do enjoy being a little bit more mobile with the classes that I play. So if that sounds like your kind of style, I would try these talents out. If you're okay with, kind of being the slow, plodding, heavy tank, then definitely look at Heartbreaker and Grip of the Dead. Now, our final ability change here is on the 100 tier. Now, this is another one where every single one of these talents has its applications and has its place as you are tanking in higher level dungeons and improving your skill. Now, for the passive build that we created, we decided to use Purgatory, and the reason for this is Purgatory is kind of like a safety net. It's a we almost died, but maybe we didn't sort of scenario, and there's still a valid reason to use this, especially if you're pushing that really high content and you're not sure how well you're going to do, or you think you're going to run into a lot of hairy situations where you are going to be right there on the brink of death and maybe you just need that extra something to keep you in the game. Purgatory is great for that. We also have Bone Storm over here. Bone Storm is a good talent to pick. It will increase the damage that you put out. So this is a whirl of bone and gore, batters nearby enemies, dealing damage every second, and healing you for 3% of your maximum health every time it deals damage, up to 15%. This lasts 1 second per 10 runic power spent. So this works as a runic power dump if you need it. It also does some nice AoE damage around you, which can help you to maintain threat, and it's going to heal you for up to 15% of your health. So it's got a healing component as well. It's a good all-around sort of talent that you can pick if the situation calls for it. Now, personally, I have chosen Red Thirst. Red Thirst reduces the cooldown on vampiric blood by 1 second per 10 runic power that you spend. So this is another kind of runic power dump ability. However, if we're looking at vampiric blood, this is one of our defensive abilities that we picked out. It's a instant cast ability on a 1.5 minute cooldown. You embrace undeath, increasing your maximum health by 30% and increasing all healing and absorbs received by 30% for 10 seconds. So this is an incredibly defensive ability that we have on a 1.5 minute cooldown. So with Red Thirst, we have the potential to reduce the cooldown on Vampiric Blood by 1 second per 10 runic power we spend. And as we're going through our rotation, we're going to be spending runic power pretty often, and this is going to drastically reduce the cooldown on Vampiric Blood, allowing us to use it more often. Now, the thing to keep in mind with Vampiric Blood is it increases all healing and absorbs. That's from your healer, but that's also from all the passive sort of healing abilities that you have as a Blood Death Knight as well. So that's going to increase, the healing that you get from Blood Boil and Death Strike, and all around this is just going to make you much more tanky, give you a little bit more of the self heal option. It's also going to help you to provide those healing burst windows to your healer much more often. And generally speaking, this is kind of the go-to talent, but the other two do have their situations where they are appropriate and possibly best choice as well. Okay, now that we have covered the changes to the talent builds, let's talk about how they might affect our rotation. So, first off, there's not a whole lot going on here as far as the talent changes go. Our rotation is going to be pretty similar to what we covered in the beginner's tanking guide. The main change ups we have is now with Red Thirst, we're going to be using Vampiric Blood more often. So, just fit that into your rotation, either every time it's off cooldown or whenever you situationally feel like you need it, depending on the level of difficulty of the content that you're doing. If you have taken Wraith Walk, then that's going to be a utility ability that you just pop when you need it. So if you need to get out of somewhere or if you need to catch up with your group, then you use Wraith Walk, right? That's not like an integral part of our rotation. Blood Drinker, I would recommend picking like the highest priority target, or if you're fighting a boss or something, and using Blood Drinker pretty much on cooldown as you can. It does cost 1 rune, and you have to keep in mind that it does drain health from the target, so it does give you some healing. So you may want to keep an eye on that, and if you're at full health, maybe you can hold off on using Blood Drinker if you're worried about needing the healing. Otherwise, just dump it on cooldown for the damage. And if you have picked up, if you're still using Heartbreaker, then your rotation is going to be the same as in the beginner's tanking guide. If you pick Grip of the Dead, once again, you're still going to use Death and Decay, essentially how you would have during the core rotation, which is trying to have it up pretty much at all times. The main thing you would change here is trying to make sure that the positioning of Death and Decay is such that it's going to prevent the maximum number of enemies from moving out of it, and it's going to increase the odds of those enemies getting affected by the movement speed delay. So that's kind of the change up here as far as the active abilities are concerned. Like I said, not a lot that's going to be changing up our rotation, so just a couple of things to keep in mind, and mostly situational use abilities here. Next up, let's talk about setting the pace. Now, setting the pace is something that I think is the job of the tank. It's up to you to kind of control the battlefield and the enemies, and also to determine kind of where your group is at and decide whether or not you need to set a faster pace or a slower pace within the dungeon. So, a scenario where you might want to set a faster pace is if you notice that pulling one group of enemies, most of your party's not really taking any damage, everything's dying really quickly, it seems like things are going very, very smoothly. In that scenario, then you could set the pace faster in order to complete the dungeon in a faster time. And this is good all around just for saving you time and getting these dungeon runs done, whether you're farming for loot, or you're trying to finish a quest, or you're trying to, get some experience from the dungeon. There's good reasons to want to be able to do this. Also, as you get into higher level content and you get into mythics, there's a timer involved, so learning how to set the pace appropriately is going to help you there as well. Some scenarios where you may want to slow down the pace might be where maybe you don't have the best gear, so you're taking a lot of damage, or maybe your healer doesn't have the best gear, so they're not able to heal you quite as well, or maybe your DPS party members are struggling to kill things, so the fights are taking a lot longer than you feel like they should. And in that scenario, you want to make sure that you slow down the pace so that you can still progress through the dungeon comfortably, and you don't get set back by party wipes and corpse runs and that kind of stuff. So on the Death Knight, we have a few different ways to do this kind of stuff. So if we are wanting to, in our normal scenario, what we're looking at is we're doing our typical pulls, whether we're pulling with our death grip, or we're leading in with our death and decay, or maybe we're using death's caress to pull a target. We're basically just taking on that group of 3 to 5 enemies at a time, and that's all there is to it. And in that scenario, you pretty much just follow your basic rotation. However, if you need to accelerate the pace, if you want to set a faster pace because you've got a pretty good group, there are a few things that you can do. So, first off, if you are engaged with a group, so let's say we are just, fighting this group of enemies here, and we're with a group that can set a pretty good pace. What we can do, we've got a couple of options, and mainly with the Death Knight, because you don't have a lot of mobility, a lot of it involves, do I pull the enemy to me, or do I go to the enemy myself? So in this scenario, we've got a couple of options. Now, first off, if you're setting a faster pace, generally speaking, you're still not going to be pulling like 3 groups at a time or something ridiculous like that, unless the content is just really, really easy for you. So usually what you're going to want to do to set a faster pace is, once there's 1, 2, possibly 3 enemies left in the group that you're fighting, you want to go ahead and engage the next group. So if I'm fighting with this group here, and let's say there's these two dummies left, and I want to pull this group of 3 over here, I have a couple of options. So the first thing I can do is, I've been putting out all of my AoE stuff here. I've got my death and decay down. I've got my blood boil going on. These guys are on me. I've got the threat. I've got the aggro for them. So what I can do is I can click over on one of these, and I can hit Death's Caress, right? And that's going to aggro this group, and they're going to run into where I'm at. And then I've got the option of, just continuing to stay where I am here. And then maybe I turn and, I can target this group over here and kind of do the same thing, send out a Death's Caress. So you can kind of shore up in one area and kind of make that, the battlefield, so your party doesn't have to move around too much. That's good if you're in a scenario where you're like in a room and there's a bunch of different groups all around, and you don't want to run the risk of aggroing extra groups of enemies. So that's something that you can do there. You can also target the enemy, and you can use your death grip to pull them into you. That's going to aggro everything. So the main thing you want to make sure of when you're pulling enemies into your area is that when they get here, you have some AoE abilities ready to go to immediately grab aggro on them. Otherwise, they're going to scatter to your party members and your healers. Your healer especially, because your healer is probably still casting heals on you from the previous group, and that's going to generate a lot of aggro against the enemies that you didn't target to pull over. So having a death and decay ready to go so that when they walk into it, you're immediately dealing damage and getting aggro, having your blood boil ready to go, that kind of stuff is going to make sure that when the enemy gets to you, you've got aggro on them. If you don't have that, like I said, you're probably in a scenario where they're going to go straight for your healer, and then you're in damage control and you're no longer setting a good pace. At that point, you're trying to figure out how to stay alive. So the other thing that you can do is, let's say you're wanting to progress through a dungeon. You're not wanting to stay in one place. Let's say you're in a corridor or something like that, and there's a group of enemies that you're fighting, and the next one is a little ways down the corridor. And what you would like to do is to continue down the corridor as you're fighting. This also will help you to set a good pace, right? Progressing through the level as you're fighting is going to help you more than staying in one spot and just trying to pull what you can. There's going to be certain scenarios where that's the best thing to do, but generally speaking, you're going to want to keep things moving. Also, because you're a Death Knight, you don't have all those nice mobility abilities that a lot of other classes do, so when you do finish off a group, then a lot of times your party members can get way ahead of you. So this is a good way to try to get ahead of them as well. And what you can do is, if you're fighting these enemies here, you've got 2 or 3 left, you've built up a pretty high amount of aggro on them. If you've been following the rotation, hitting your death and decays, hitting your blood boils, all that kind of good stuff. So what you can do instead of trying to pull a group over to you is you can go over to the group. Now, you face the same kind of problem here where if you walk into the group, you don't really have aggro on them. So you have to be prepared for that. So a lot of times what I will do is I will move towards the next group with a death and decay ready, and I will put that death and decay kind of right in this position here. So it catches every enemy on the far side of the death and decay. And then what's going to happen is I drop that death and decay, I keep moving into it, they keep moving in towards me, and that means I get the full death and decay ticks on each one of those enemies, which helps me build aggro. And as soon as I get here, I'm going to hit Blood Boil, and that is going to increase the amount of threat that I have on those enemies. And what's going to happen is because these enemies here are already aggroed to you, they're going to follow you, and they're going to catch this backside of the death and decay as they follow you in, and then they're going to get ticks. That's going to help you maintain your aggro, and generally speaking, about the time you get here and you're ready to hit Blood Boil, those enemies have caught up to you, they get hit by the Blood Boil as well. So that's a good way to move one group of enemies that's almost dead into the next group of enemies. Also, what happens here, and this is kind of a little tank trick, generally speaking it works pretty well for the Death Knights, is because this group here is almost dead, your party members will want to finish this group off, meaning that while they're doing that and you're engaged with the new group, you're able to build up a good amount of aggro and threat on these enemies before your party members even really touch them. So it kind of eliminates some of the problem of if you run into the damage dealing party members who, like to throw the first fireball, so to speak, and not let you pull as a tank. This is kind of a good way that you can mitigate that on a Death Knight. Okay, so that's some ways that you can sort of accelerate the pace. Also with this build, you can do the same thing. You can hit your Wraith Walk and allow that to get you ahead of your party members so you can get into the next group a lot quicker. You've got some different options here, but generally speaking, that's how you're going to set the pace to be a little bit faster if your group is good enough to want to do that. Now, if you want to slow down the pace, then it's kind of your job to do the exact opposite, right? You want to pull a single group at a time. You don't want to get yourself into trouble. So chances are you're going to clear a little space where there's no enemies around, maybe back here or something. And then you'll go up, you'll get one enemy, you'll do your Death's Caress, you'll kind of pull them back. Once again, you might run into the scenario where you have a party member who likes to throw the first fireball. And so in this situation, you may need to hit like your Death's Caress to kind of pull that initial enemy, run up a little bit. They should run in towards you here, and then you can hit Blood Boil, and then move back into position, and then cast your Death and Decay. What you don't want to do is cast your Death and Decay way up here, like I did when I was walking into the next group, because what's going to happen is you need to pull that group back, and so if you cast that Death and Decay initially, it's going to be up there doing nothing, while you're back here trying to hold your aggro with basically just Blood Boil and possibly Heart Strike. So in that situation, like I said, you're going to want to make sure that you pull things back. Also, if you're having to slow the pace, it's generally because one of three problems. Either you're not geared enough, so your healer is struggling to heal you, and as a result, that's affecting the entire party. That's generally, if you're playing pretty well, that's generally the least likely scenario, because you should have a good understanding of your defensive abilities and how well you can progress. We're talking about setting the pace, and a lot of that is how comfortable you feel at the difficulty level that you're at. So that's probably the least likely scenario. The more likely scenario is either that your healer is struggling to heal either yourself or the party, because the party is taking a lot of damage that they shouldn't. Maybe they're standing in AoEs that they could easily avoid, etc., etc. And so instead of the healer being able to focus on healing you and maybe occasionally topping off one of the party members, they're having to spread themselves too thin, or maybe they're just not geared well enough to be able to heal the whole party or to keep you up. That happens sometimes. More than likely it's because the party members are standing in AoE that they shouldn't or something, and the healer is just spreading themselves too thin. So in that scenario, your healer is really struggling. You got to slow the pace down, make sure that they don't get more overwhelmed than they already are. The other scenario is that maybe you and the healer are doing fine, but your DPS, for whatever reason, is not killing the enemies very quickly. And in that scenario, if it's taking a long time for your DPS to kill the enemies and you pull a second group of enemies, it doesn't really matter how well you can tank and how well your healer can heal a lot of the times, because eventually your resources and your options run out. If there are enemies that are just constantly pummeling you and they're not getting killed by the damage dealers, then eventually at some point your healer runs out of mana, your defensive abilities are on cooldown, and it's just a struggle, right? It's a three-way thing in a dungeon. The tank has to hold aggro so everyone can do their jobs. The healer has to heal everybody so everybody can focus on what they need to do. And the damage dealers need to kill things quickly enough so that the healer and the tank don't get overwhelmed. So everything's got to kind of work in synergy, and generally when one of those is off, that's when you need to slow down the pace. So for the Death Knight, generally speaking, like I said, you're going to want to pull things to you, hit things with your Blood Boil, bring them back, use your Death and Decay, and then you're going to want to focus either on your defensive abilities if your healer is struggling, or your offensive abilities if your DPS is struggling. So if your healer is struggling, then you're going to want to be using Vampiric Blood as much as you possibly can in order to boost your own health and also allow your healer to get that bonus 30% healing every 10 seconds. You've got your Icebound Fortitude, which is going to reduce damage you take by 30%. Anti-Magic Shield to counter a magic ability if you can keep that up. So you're going to want to be using that stuff. Maybe focus on your Death Strike as well to provide some self-healing and help your healer out in that scenario. If it's your DPS and they're struggling, then you're going to want to switch to more offensive oriented stuff, where you're going to want to use Dancing Rune Weapon. If you've got Blood Drinker, that's a good time to start hitting Blood Drinker on cooldown. You can focus on your Heart Strike AoEs, etc., etc. So that's how you can kind of slow down the pace on a Death Knight. Okay, now that we've talked about setting the pace, we're going to talk about something that's related to that, which is how to play more aggressively or more defensively as the Death Knight. Now this is different from setting the pace, because setting the pace, you're looking at the party as a whole, right? How's my party doing? Are they doing well? Speed it up. Are they not doing so well? Slow it down. In this situation, we're just looking at, personally, as a Blood Death Knight, how do I play more aggressively, more offensively versus more defensively? This can apply to whether you're out there, soloing in the open world or in a dungeon as well. Now, generally speaking, what's going to happen is when you choose to play offensively, you're going to sacrifice some defensive tools. When you are choosing to play defensively, you're going to sacrifice some offensive tools. So what are those tools, and how do we best use them in order to fit the current situation? So if we're wanting to play aggressively on a Blood Death Knight, then basically we're ignoring these three skills here for the most part. Vampiric Blood, Icebound Fortitude, and Magic Shell. Now you can still cast these, because the nice thing about these is they're just cooldown based and they don't take any resources, so you can still hit them whenever you need to, but you're not going to prioritize those in your rotation, right? If you've got a gap in your rotation and these are off of cooldown, then sure, you can hit them, help everybody out, and keep on going. What you are going to do instead is you're going to focus on using your Heart Strike and your Death and Decay to output more AoE damage. So what you're going to do here is you're going to put your Death and Decay down, and then you're just going to start Heart Striking. This is going to take up your runes, and then as you build up your runic power, then you're just going to drop your death strikes, and you're not going to worry about the healing, right? Every time you get a death strike, you just hit it, hit it, hit it, hit it, right? We're playing more aggressively, so we're sacrificing some of that defensive and self-healing ability. Now, if you're in a situation where you're wanting to play aggressively, then either your group is doing really well, your healer is on point, and you don't really need to worry that much about the self-healing. You're going to want to keep your bone shield stacks up, right? Because that's a big integral part of being a Death Knight tank, so you don't want to forget about that. But you're going to focus on that Death and Decay, Heart Strike, and then just drop Death Strike every single chance that you get. You're going to do Blood Drinker on cooldown, because that does a ton of damage. You can also use your Gorfiend's Grasp just to pull things in so that you can Heart Strike them even better. Make sure you keep your Blood Boils up. On a Death Knight, it's not too crazy compared to what your normal rotation is, right? You're just going to mainly not worry about the heals for Death Strike. You're not going to worry too much about your defensive abilities. You are going to use Dancing Rune Weapon, however, and this is an ability that you can use offensively or defensively. And this is kind of where the biggest change comes in. And so Dancing Rune Weapon, just to recap, it summons a rune weapon for 8 seconds that mirrors your melee attacks and bolsters your defensives. While active, you gain 40% parry chance. So you could pop Dancing Rune Weapon, you hit Blood Boil, and that's going to put multiple Blood Boil stacks on every single target. You put Death and Decay down. That doesn't do anything special. There's not like extra Death and Decay ticks, but every time you Heart Strike, you'll double Heart Strike because of Dancing Rune Weapon. That pumps out a lot of AoE damage all at once. Then when you Death Strike, you'll double Death Strike for double damage. Now, to switch gears and play defensively, we'll lead into this with Dancing Rune Weapon. If you pop Dancing Rune Weapon and you need to be defensive, right? Let's say, a bunch of your party members have died and you're just trying to stay alive and kill this one last enemy, or, let your rogue kill the one last enemy while you tank it. Then what you can do is you pop Dancing Rune Weapon, you get your Blood Boil, right? Because that's going to give you healing. Then you do whatever you have to build up the runic power for Death Strike, and you Death Strike as much as possible when you need the healing, because this is going to double that for you. So what you would do is build it up, and if you're at full health for some reason, which you're probably not in this scenario, then you would wait. Don't cast that Death Strike right away, right? Wait till you can get that extra healing from it, and you could use that defensively to help you out. And really, that's kind of how it goes for a Death Knight. There's not really a whole lot of change. For the most part, your abilities are pretty straightforward, and there's not a whole lot of ways to manipulate them. In that scenario where you're playing defensively, then you do want to focus on Vampiric Blood, Icebound Fortitude on cooldown. You want to make sure that you are funneling everything into Death Strike for the self-heal. Maintain your bone shield stacks. You can use Blood Drinker when you need healing as opposed to on cooldown. So instead of just hitting it every single time that it comes up, wait until you need the healing and then cast Blood Drinker to get the healing from that. So you're just kind of alternating the way that the abilities are used. On a lot of classes, you can just drop abilities completely. On the Death Knight, it's more about the timing. Right? Do I use the ability when my health bar is full because I don't care about the healing? I just want to hit that ability every cooldown for the DPS, or do I wait until my health bar has taken a hit so that I can use this ability to heal? Because that's a lot of what our abilities do. Some kind of damage, some kind of healing. So keep that in mind when you're trying to play more aggressively. Just focus on trying to hit those abilities on cooldown. Use your AoEs. If you're trying to play defensively, make sure that you're timing things so that you are getting the actual healing from the abilities as well. Alright, well that is the advanced tanking guide for the Blood Death Knight. If you were expecting a dungeon run, because that's what I've done in the past, what I have found by checking out the analytics of the videos is that most people tend to fall off after the dungeon run portion of the guide, so I opted not to do that here. This will also help me to put these guides out a little bit faster. I'll still be doing the dungeon runs on the beginner's guides because I think those are really valuable, and those definitely do show a higher retention rate once that does start. If you feel like you really needed the dungeon run in order to incorporate what you've learned here in the advanced guide, please let me know in the comments section below, and I will consider doing a dungeon run as a separate video that can be watched by those who are interested. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you've learned something here today. I hope you're enjoying whatever it is that you're doing, and as always, I'll see you on the next video.